The wind howled unnaturally that night, carrying with it eerie wails that seemed to come from another realm. The small mountain town, Shadow Valley, was enveloped in an almost suffocating silence, broken only by the screeching of rusted signs swaying outside deserted shops. My arrival in this place had been driven by a quest for peace and isolation, far from the clamor of city life, to find the inspiration I needed to complete my next horror novel. However, the atmosphere I encountered here far exceeded any literary invention I could have ever imagined. The first night was pierced by the distant and spectral crying of a child. This sound, so out of place in that setting, struck me deeply, instilling a morbid curiosity that soon turned into obsession. I decided to follow it, a decision that marked the beginning of a descent into terror I could have never imagined. With every step I took on the cobblestone streets, the crying seemed to grow louder, more desperate, leading me through winding alleys I didn't recall seeing during the day. The cold night air bit at my face, and the uncertain light of the moon barely filtered through the moving clouds, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. I began to notice fleeting figures moving just outside the beam of my flashlight, disappearing as soon as I tried to focus on them better. The path led me out of the town onto an old country road that meandered towards the forest. Here the shadows seemed even denser, almost tangible, and the sounds of the night intensified, blending with the crying that continued to guide me. Twisted trees stood against the night sky, their gnarled branches like arms stretched out in menacing gestures. It was in this setting that I first felt the sensation of not being alone. Something or someone was watching me, hidden in the darkness, following me with a gaze I could feel more than see, a disturbing weight on my shoulders. Ignoring the flight instinct whispering to me to turn back, I continued, driven by a force I couldn't understand. The crying finally led me in front of an ancient mansion, so decrepit it seemed impossible it was still standing. The slightly ajar door beckoned me, a sealant whisper promising answers beyond the threshold. I crossed the door with hesitation, the creaking of the hinges opening like a cry of warning. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with ancient and forgotten smells. Mold, rotting wood, and something sweet I couldn't identify but made my stomach churn. Dust danced in the air currents that crossed the corridors, and every step I took echoed with a deafening sound, almost a muffled wail echoing in the empty rooms. Guided by the crying, which now seemed to come from every corner of the house, I climbed the creaking stairs. Each step seemed to hesitate before bearing my weight, as if debating whether to give way or not. At the top, I found myself in a long corridor, its walls decorated with faded portraits. Their eyes, wide and glassy, stared at me with an unsettling intensity, as if they were following my every move. An oppressive cloak of terror squeezed my chest, while my heart pounded wildly in my ears. The room that welcomed me at the end of the corridor was a sanctuary of dust and neglect. At its center stood an ancient cradle, and inside a porcelain doll that seemed to have been waiting for my arrival for decades. Its tears, strangely realistic, shone in the moonlight, tracing dark furrows on its faded cheeks. I approached, driven by an irresistible curiosity to observe it more closely. In the blink of an eye, its pallid eyelids snapped open, revealing pitch-black pupils that rotated towards me with a swift and unnatural movement. A shiver of terror ran down my spine as I stared into its demonic face, frozen in an expression of pure evil, heralding the beginning of a nightmare from which I would find no escape. A sound behind me made me jump. The door I'd just passed through had shut with a sinister thud. I was alone in that room with the doll staring at me with a penetrating gaze. The darkness thickened and the air turned suddenly cold, so much that my breath condensed into a cloud of vapor. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the dense darkness, which seemed to swallow everything. A sense of despair enveloped me as a hand as cold as death rested on my shoulder. "You've disturbed her," hissed a terrifying voice, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "And now, you can never leave this place." I spun around, terror pumping through my veins like a raging river. But there was no one behind me, just an endless black abyss that seemed to devour the light itself. Where was that voice coming from? How was it possible that an invisible hand had touched me? A shiver ran down my spine, making me falter for a moment. The doll, motionless in its cradle, seemed to smirk maliciously. My mind refused to accept the impossible reality in which I had trapped myself. I shouldn't stay a second longer in that hell of horrors. The survival instinct pushed me to search for a way out. Any exit from this nightmare that was becoming more vivid and oppressive. I desperately searched every corner of the mansion, but every attempt ended in front of doors that led to even darker rooms, corridors that narrowed until they became suffocating, stairs that stretched into endless descents, as if the house had decided to torture me with its impossible geometry. It was just the beginning of my journey into terror, a path that would lead me through unimaginable horrors, into a spiral of madness and torment. Desperation pushed me to scour the ancient mansion with maniacal attention. Every room hid new and unimaginable horrors, scenes of decay and desolation that seemed to be birthed from a perverse mind. In one, a pendulum clock with a twisted face ticked not the time but the intensifying of my anguish with its discordant chimes. Its hands ran backward, dragging me into a vortex of madness. In another room, I found the remains of a meal, plates full of mold, rotten food turned into a slimy and unrecognizable mush. Overturned chairs on the floor suggested a precipitous flight, perhaps in terror. Or worse, an even more sinister event. The silence in that place was so oppressive, I felt it in my ears, a mute witness to agonizing screams and desperate pleas now lost in time. The exploration finally led me to a grand ballroom, where echoes of laughter and faded music floated among the dust-laden walls. Mirrors, framed by elaborate carvings, covered every surface, multiplying my image into a labyrinth of distorted reflections. In this den of silvered glass, evanescent figures danced a macabre waltz, their movements stiff and unnatural as if every step was torment. Drawn by an imperceptible call, I approached one of the mirrors. My reflection stared back at me with eyes full of hatred. In a moment of terror, I saw its expression twist into a grimace of anger. Then, with a sudden movement, it turned its back to me, revealing a back scarred with infected wounds, teeming with worms and yellowish pus, emitting a nauseating odor of rotting flesh. A piercing scream escaped my lips as a searing pain shot through my body. For a moment, long and atrocious, I felt the same wounds of my reflection burning on my skin, as if the pain had crossed the mirror, uniting our sufferings into a single, eternal agony. Staggering backward, I fell to the ground, exhausted and shaken. My macabre reflection in the mirror continued to stare at me, its wicked smile, a cruel mockery of my torment. Struggling to my feet, I staggered away, trying to escape that image of pain. It was then that I noticed a strange bookshelf, hidden in a dark corner of the room. The books were dusty and bound in leather that seemed human. Touching one of the books in disgust, the bookshelf silently slid aside, revealing a secret passage. Inside a decrepit conservatory, where dead and withered plants twisted into agonizing shapes as if trying to escape their imprisonment. At the center stood a barren tree, its dry branches adorned with small objects belonging to children. Toys, shoes, locks of hair. Each object pulsed with such intense melancholy that it brought me to my knees. A wave of sorrow, completely engulfing me. Just when I thought I had hit the bottom of the abyss, a chilling whisper brushed my ear. Shivering, I turned around swiftly, and my blood froze in my veins. Before me, still as a funerary statue, stood a female figure staring at me with an intensity that paralyzed me. Her appearance was cadaveric, her skin of a spectral pallor, contrasting with the deep black of her hair. Her lips, bluish like death, were parted in a sinister smile that revealed teeth as sharp as those of a beast. A crumpled dress, akin to a shroud worn by centuries, wrapped her thin, almost skeletal body. Her face, half covered by a thin veil stained with blood, allowed a glimpse of her disturbing eyes. Eyes that shone with an unnatural yellow light, like will-o'-the-wisps in the night. Seeking answers, she hissed with a voice that seemed to come from another dimension, a lament that resonated in my bones. But are you willing to pay the price? Before I could articulate a response, her repugnant form dissolved into the air, leaving me in surreal silence. My labored breathing was the only sound daring to break the spectral quiet. Still shaken by the horrors I had witnessed, I tried to make sense of the nightmare I had sunk into. Sitting on the cold stone floor of the conservatory, surrounded by dead plants that seemed to weep for a lost life, I began to reflect on my situation. How did I end up here? I wondered, my mind still clouded by disbelief. And this house, this place, can they really exist? The air, though still and cold, felt less oppressive, almost granting me a reprieve from the relentless terror. As I surveyed my surroundings, trying to find a glimmer of logic in this madness, the solitude and silence, instead of offering comfort, left me tense in a perpetual state of agitation. Am I truly alone? I pondered, sensing the presence of something or someone watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then she reappeared, emerging from nothingness before my wide-eyed stare. The female figure, more spectral than ever, was so close I could feel the icy breath of death on my face. Her face, now horribly deformed, brushed against mine. Those eyes, turned into endless pits of darkness, stared at me with an intensity that left me breathless. My heart pounded so hard I feared it might burst. With slow, almost curious movements, she tilted her head first to the right and then to the left, as if evaluating an unusual object, or perhaps prey before the feast. A choked scream died in my throat as her mouth gaped open. Enormous jaws, defying all physical laws, expanded into an abyss of terror. A void of darkness swallowed me whole. And then, total darkness. A darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but an oppressive entity that crushed me, devouring every sense and thought. I was suspended in a timeless void, a desolate wasteland where my soul wandered aimlessly. The last glimmer of consciousness clung to a desperate wish to wake up, to escape this endless nightmare. I fought against the darkness, trying to tear a shred of reality from the nothingness that imprisoned me. My mind was a battlefield, where echoes of terror clashed with the faint hope of a return to light. I don't know how long I fought, an eternity or a mere instant, before a glimmer of light finally pierced the darkness. I found myself in an aseptic room, surrounded by white, sterile walls. A hospital bed received me, rigid and impersonal as the light filtering through the windows. Medical equipment emitted monotonous sounds, a constant rhythm contrasting with the tumult of my heart. Confusion enveloped me. How had I arrived here? What had happened to the house, the doll, to the veiled woman, to the beast that had devoured me? A wave of terror swept through my body. Was it all real? Or just a nightmare, a hallucination born from my traumatized mind? The door of the room creaked open and a figure in a white coat entered. "Well, I see you're finally awake," the man said in a professional tone. "You had quite a scare, huh? But now you're safe. Don't worry." His words puzzled me. Trying to piece together the puzzle, I asked about the house, the doll, the horrific creatures I had encountered. But the man in the white coat looked at me with a mix of concern and compassion. I observed him, trying to decipher his gaze. "You suffered a terrible accident 6 months ago," he explained calmly. "A severe head trauma. You've been in a coma all this time. The morphine we administered might have caused some visual hallucinations." The accident, a coma. The words echoed in my mind, refusing to form a logical sense. Yet a part of me wanted to cling to that explanation, wanted to believe that everything had been just a dream induced by a head trauma. Days passed, and with the help of the hospital staff, I began to walk, talk, remember fragments of my life before the accident. Therapy was tough, but each day brought improvements. The story of the house, the doll, the veiled woman became a distant memory, a nightmare from which I had been fortunate to wake up. The day of my discharge arrived. With uncertain but determined steps, I walked through the hospital corridors, greeted by doctors and nurses who had assisted me during my convalescence. Outside, the fresh morning air welcomed me like an embrace, promising new beginnings. As I approached the car that would take me home, a sudden shiver ran down my spine. A powerful, unsettling sense of déjà vu. I turned the key in the lock, opened the car door, and sat behind the wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. The car engine grumbled for a moment before starting, a familiar hum in stark contrast to the turmoil of my mind. But the sense of déjà vu intensified. My breath became short, heavy, as my trembling hand sought grip on the steering wheel. My pupils dilated in terror as I stared into the rearview mirror. The doll, with its mocking smile and wide eyes emitting a malign light, sat on the back seat. Beside her, the female figure stood in all her terrifying power. The blood-stained veil was lifted, revealing a face marred by sores and wounds. A mask of unspeakable evil. Her jaws, gaping in an impossible smile, flaunted a row of teeth sharp as blades, ready to tear flesh. A chilling hiss pierced my soul. Welcome back. My heart stopped. Before I could press the accelerator or scream for help, the creature lunged at me with supernatural speed. Its jaws opened into an endless abyss, engulfing my body in a deadly embrace. Razor-sharp teeth sank into my flesh with unheard-of ferocity, unleashing of searing pain. My vision blurred. The outside world dissolved into a vortex of blood and agonizing screams. Guttural gasps and the macabre feast of the monster devouring me slowly faded. My existence dimmed as an overwhelming silence descended, sealing my fate forever. Then nothingness. Only the abyss of oblivion.